Imagine waking up one morning and being told that your neighbor has accused you of stealing his goat. There is no evidence. There are no witnesses. There is no court of law waiting patiently to examine the facts. Instead, a crowd gathers in the village square. A priest begins reciting prayers in Latin, and someone hands you a piece of glowing iron fresh from a fire. This is not a nightmare. This is an ordinary Tuesday in medieval Europe. And this is what justice looked like for hundreds of years across one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. A civilization that built cathedrals reaching toward the sky, composed music of extraordinary beauty, and produced philosophers who contemplated the deepest questions of human existence. The same civilization that also burned people alive for arguing with the wrong priest, stretched men's bodies on wooden frames until their joints separated, and considered public torture a perfectly reasonable form of community entertainment. What you are about to hear is not a collection of exaggerated horror stories. These are documented historical practices, recorded by the very governments and religious institutions that enforce them. For centuries across medieval and early modern Europe, punishment was not designed to reform criminals, to rehabilitate the guilty, or even simply to remove dangerous people from society. Punishment was designed to be witnessed. It was designed to be loud, visible, painful, and unforgettable. Every broken bone, every public branding, every execution carried out before crowds of hundreds was a message written directly onto human flesh, and the message was always the same. The people in power can do this to you. And they believed, with complete sincerity, that they were doing the right thing. That is perhaps the most disturbing part of everything you are about to hear. The rack was not invented by monsters. It was invented by administrators. Practical, organized, bureaucratic men who sat in stone offices, surrounded by official documents, and decided that the most efficient way to extract a confession was to tie a human being between two wooden rollers and slowly pull their body apart in opposite direction. The device itself was deceptively simple in design. A wooden frame, roughly the length of a man, with rollers at each end, connected by a system of ropes, chains, or iron bars. The prisoner's wrists were bound to one roller, their ankles to the other. Then an operator, the shoulders stretched first, followed by the elbows, the hips, the knees, and the spine. If the operator continued long enough, the joints did not merely ache, they separated entirely, producing a sound that witnesses described in court documents with a consistency that makes clear none of them ever forgot hearing it. What made the rack particularly effective as a tool of power was not only the pain it produced, but the anticipation it created before a single turn of the mechanism. Prisoners brought into a torture chamber and shown the rack frequently confessed before anyone touched them, which was precisely the point. The Tower of London used the rack extensively during the 16th century, and historical records show that the threat alone was often documented as sufficient to obtain cooperation. Authorities understood that fear traveled faster than pain. A government that wanted confessions did not always need to cause suffering. It simply needed people to believe that suffering was coming, inevitable, authorized, and completely beyond appeal. The rack was the physical embodiment of that belief. It was justice reduced to geometry, truth extracted through the simple mechanical principle that the human body, pulled hard enough in two directions, will eventually agree to anything. Before television, before public squares filled with market stalls and street performers, before any form of organized entertainment existed for ordinary working people, there was the flogging post, and crowds came willingly. They came early, in fact, securing good positions along the street or in the market square, the way modern audiences arrive ahead of time for concerts or sporting events. They brought children. They brought elderly relatives. They stood together in the cold morning air, breathing steam into the winter sky. And they watched while a court-appointed official raised a leather whip, a birch rod, or a knotted rope above the bare back of a convicted man or woman, and brought it down again and again with the full legal authority of the state behind every single stroke. Public flogging was practiced across medieval Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and colonial territories for centuries, and it was not considered brutal by the societies that practiced it. It was considered necessary, proportionate, and above all, educational. Not for the person being flogged necessarily, but for everyone watching. The real audience was always the crowd. The philosophy behind public corporal punishment was straightforward and, by its own internal logic, almost rational. Medieval and early modern governments lacked the resources to build large prison systems, employ professional police forces, or investigate crimes with anything resembling modern methodology. What they possessed instead was visibility. A flogging carried out in public cost almost nothing to administer, required no ongoing expense, and sent a message across an entire community simultaneously. Magistrates in medieval England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire operated on the firm belief that witnessing punishment was itself a form of social control, that ordinary people watching a convicted thief receive 40 lashes in the town square would carry that image home with them and think twice before stealing anything themselves. Whether this actually reduced crime is a question historians have debated at length. What is beyond debate is that the crowds kept coming, week after week, year after year, standing in mud and rain to watch the proceedings with an attentiveness that modern governments would envy deeply. Not every punishment in medieval Europe required blood. Some of the most effective tools of control required nothing more than a wooden frame, a public square, and the reliable cruelty of an audience with nowhere else to be. The pillory was exactly this: a hinged wooden board with holes cut to hold a prisoner's head and both wrists in place, mounted on a post at standing height in the most visible location the local authorities could find: markets, town squares, cathedral steps, busy crossroads, anywhere that guaranteed a maximum number of witnesses throughout the course of a day. The convicted person stood locked in position for hours, sometimes an entire day, completely unable to move, unable to protect themselves, unable to look away from whatever the crowd decided to throw at them. And medieval crowds, it must be said, brought considerable creativity and enthusiasm to this particular civic activity. Rotten vegetables were standard. Mud, animal waste, and stones were common. In more severe cases, the crowd threw objects with genuine intent to injure, and authorities made no effort whatsoever to stop them. What distinguished the pillory from other punishments was its psychological architecture. The rack destroyed the body in private, behind stone walls where screams echoed only for official ears. The pillory destroyed something else entirely, in full daylight, before everyone a person had ever known. It attacked reputation, dignity, and social identity simultaneously. In medieval communities, where nearly everyone knew everyone else, where your standing among neighbors determined your ability to trade, borrow, marry, and survive, being locked in the pillory for a single afternoon could effectively end a life without ending it physically. People returned from the pillory with broken bones from thrown objects, permanent facial injuries, and in some recorded cases, they did not return at all, having died from the crowd's attentions before officials released them. Yet the court records show these sentences handed down with the same administrative calm used for minor fines, as though standing a human being in a wooden frame for public destruction was simply another item on a Tuesday afternoon docket, which, for medieval magistrates, it genuinely was. Medieval justice was not always satisfied with punishment that ended when the sentence ended. For certain crimes, authorities wanted something more permanent, something that would follow a convicted person out of the courthouse, through the market, into every tavern, every church, every new village they attempted to start a fresh life in. Branding accomplished this with brutal efficiency. An iron tool, shaped into a letter or symbol corresponding to the crime, was heated in an open fire until it glowed, and then pressed firmly against exposed skin. Usually the cheek, the forehead, the hand, or the shoulder, held there long enough to leave a scar that no amount of time or distance could erase. The letter chosen was rarely subtle. In medieval England, a thief might receive the letter T burned permanently into their thumb. A blasphemer might receive B on their forehead. A person convicted of vagrancy, which in many medieval legal systems simply meant being poor and moving between towns without official permission, could be branded on the chest or face as a warning to every community they subsequently entered. The mark announced the crime before the person could speak a single word in their own defense. What made branding so revealing about medieval attitudes toward justice was the thinking embedded inside it. Modern legal systems operate, at least in theory, on the idea that a person who has served their sentence has paid their debt and deserves the opportunity to reintegrate into society. Medieval authorities held a fundamentally different belief. Certain crimes, in their view, revealed something permanent about a person's character, a corruption of the soul, that no punishment could repair, and that society, therefore, needed to see clearly and permanently displayed. A branded person carried their conviction into every future interaction, every job negotiation, every attempt to rent lodging or purchase food. Landlords turned them away. Employers refused them work. Communities drove them out. The brand did not merely record a past crime. It actively created a future of exclusion, ensuring that the punishment continued long after the official sentence had concluded, silently, permanently, written in scar tissue across a face that could never be hidden. In the year 1692, in the town of Salem, Massachusetts, an 80-year-old farmer named Giles Corey was led into a field, laid flat on the ground, and covered with a large wooden board. Heavy stones were then placed on top of that board, one at a time, over the course of 2 days, while officials stood nearby and periodically asked him a single question: "How do you plead?" Corey never answered. He never entered a plea. He understood something about the legal system surrounding him with a clarity that cost him everything. If he pleaded guilty or innocent, the court would seize all of his property and leave his family with nothing. If he refused to plead entirely, he could be pressed until he either submitted or died, but his estate would remain legally intact for his children. He chose to remain silent. His reported final words, after 2 days beneath increasing weight, were simply more weight. He died without entering a plea, and his property passed to his family, exactly as he intended. It remains one of the most extraordinary acts of deliberate endurance in recorded legal history, and it happened because pressing to death was a recognized judicial procedure with established rules and official paperwork. The practice, known formally as peine forte et dure, meaning strong and hard punishment in medieval French, was not originally designed to kill. It was designed to compel. English common law required that a defendant enter a formal plea before a trial could proceed, which created an immediate problem when defendants refused to cooperate. Authorities needed a mechanism to force compliance, and pressing provided one. A prisoner who refused to plead would be taken to a cold stone floor, stretched flat, and loaded with increasing weight until cooperation seemed preferable to continuation. In theory, the prisoner could end the process at any moment, simply by agreeing to plead. In practice, some prisoners calculated, as Giles Corey did centuries later, that dying under the stones was preferable to the consequences of entering the legal system at all. Medieval courts responded to this problem, not by questioning the procedure, but by increasing the weight more quickly. The logic was airtight by the standards of the era. The law required a plea. The prisoner refused to give one. Therefore, the law required pressure. What happened to the human body beneath that pressure was, from an administrative perspective, entirely the prisoner's own decision. In 1531, King Henry VIII of England signed into law one of the most specific and deliberately horrifying pieces of legislation in British legal history. The Act for poisoning made poisoning a crime punishable not by hanging, not by beheading, not by any of the relatively swift execution methods available at the time, but by being boiled alive in a large cauldron of water or oil before a public audience. The law was passed in direct response to a case involving a cook named Richard Roos, who had poisoned a pot of porridge at the household of the Bishop of Rochester, killing 2 people and making 17 others severely ill. Henry, who had his own complicated relationship with food, trust, and the people preparing his meals, decided that ordinary execution was insufficient for this particular category of crime. Poisoning was considered uniquely cowardly, a hidden crime, a betrayal dressed as nourishment. It therefore required a punishment that was neither hidden nor swift. Richard Roos was boiled to death in Smithfield that same year, in public, before a crowd that contemporary accounts describe as enormous. The law remained on the English books for 16 years before being quietly repealed, but during those 16 years, it was enforced with complete seriousness. What is important to understand about boiling as a legal punishment is that England was not an isolated case of extreme judicial thinking. Across medieval and early modern Europe, boiling appeared in legal codes, as a prescribed punishment for specific categories of crime, particularly counterfeiting currency, which authorities regarded as an attack on the stability of the entire economic system and therefore deserving of a response proportionally severe. In the Holy Roman Empire, coiners, meaning people who produced fraudulent currency, were sometimes executed by being lowered into boiling water or molten metal, occasionally feet first, to extend the duration of the process. The deliberate, staged nature of these executions was not incidental cruelty. It was the entire point. Medieval authorities understood instinctively what modern behavioral psychologists would later confirm through research. The severity of a witness punishment creates a far deeper impression on observers than a punishment that is merely described to them afterward. Boiling a man alive in a public square was not efficient. Hanging was faster, cheaper, and equally final. Boiling was chosen specifically because it was not efficient, because it lasted long enough for every person in the crowd to understand, with complete physical clarity, exactly what the law was capable of doing to those who crossed it. The breaking wheel was not a subtle instrument. It did not pretend to be humane, efficient, or proportionate. It was designed with a single purpose so nakedly brutal that even hardened medieval executioners reportedly required specific training before being trusted to operate it correctly. The device itself was a large wooden cartwheel, the kind used on heavy farm wagons, mounted horizontally on a tall post in the center of a public space. A convicted criminal, usually someone found guilty of murder, treason, or violent robbery, would be tied spread-eagled to the wheel, with their limbs stretched outward across the spokes. The executioner would then move systematically around the wheel with a large iron-edged hammer, striking each limb at precise intervals between the joints, shattering the bones without immediately killing the person beneath the blows. Arms first, then legs. Then, depending on the sentence handed down by the court, and medieval courts specified these details with remarkable administrative precision, the executioner would either deliver a final blow to the chest or abdomen to end the process, or simply leave the condemned person woven between the spokes, alive and broken, to be raised upright on the post, and left there for days while birds circled overhead and the town went about its ordinary business below. The breaking wheel was used extensively across France, Germany, and the broader Holy Roman Empire from the medieval period well into the 18th century, and what the historical record reveals about it is deeply unsettling, not merely because of the suffering it produced, but because of the seriousness and care with which authorities administered it. Court documents from German principalities show judges specifying the exact number of blows to be delivered, the precise sequence of the limbs, and whether the condemned person was to receive mercy blows early in the process, or be left to expire slowly over hours or days. These were not casual decisions. They were deliberate legal judgments made by educated men sitting in formal courtrooms who believed, with complete conviction, that the punishment fit the crime, and that the public witnessing of it served a vital social function. Voltaire, the French philosopher, witnessed a breaking wheel execution in the 18th century, and wrote about it with a horror that contributed directly to his lifelong campaign against judicial torture. He described the crowd not as disturbed, but as attentive, watching the proceedings with the focused concentration of people observing something they considered both terrible and necessary. That combination, terror accepted as necessity, was perhaps the defining characteristic of medieval punishment at its most extreme. In medieval England, the law was careful to distinguish between different categories of death. Ordinary criminals were hanged. That was sufficient. Their bodies dropped, their necks broke or did not break, and the matter was concluded with reasonable speed. But treason was not an ordinary crime. Treason was an attack on the king himself, on the divine order that medieval society believed God had personally arranged, on the entire structure of authority that held civilization together. And for that category of offense, English law developed a punishment so deliberately elaborate, so carefully staged across multiple hours of controlled suffering, that it functioned less as an execution, and more as a public theological statement about the relationship between loyalty, power, and the consequences of betraying both. The full sentence, handed down by English courts from the 13th century onward, required that the convicted traitor be dragged through the streets behind a horse to the place of execution, hanged by the neck until nearly dead, cut down while still conscious, disemboweled while alive, their organs burned before their eyes, beheaded, and finally have their body cut into 4 pieces, each of which would be displayed in a different public location, as a warning to anyone who passed beneath them. The sentence was not metaphorical. It was carried out with precise, deliberate attention to every detail. The most famous application of this punishment in the historical record is the execution of William Wallace, the Scottish resistance leader, in London in 1305, but the historical record contains hundreds of similar cases, stretching across several centuries of English legal practice. What the documents reveal is not the chaos of mob violence, but the cold organization of state procedure. Executioners were paid professionals. The sequence of the sentence was legally mandated. Crowds were managed, officials observed, and recorded. The entire proceeding was conducted with the formal gravity of a state ceremony, because that is precisely what it was. Medieval English authorities understood that the manner of a traitor's death communicated something essential to every person who witnessed it, or heard it described afterward. It communicated that the power of the crown was total, that resistance carried consequences extending beyond death itself, and that the king's justice did not merely end a life but unmade it, piece by piece, publicly and permanently. The quartered body parts mounted above city gates and on bridge posts served a specific administrative function. They were reminders, weather-worn and eventually skeletal, that the state's memory was longer than any individual life, and that loyalty was not merely advisable, but, in the most literal possible sense, a matter of keeping yourself in one piece. The Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478 by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain, and it operated with the full authority of both the Catholic Church and the Spanish crown simultaneously, which meant that resisting it was not merely legally dangerous, but theologically catastrophic. The institution was created originally to investigate and punish Christians who had converted from Judaism or Islam, but were suspected of secretly continuing their former religious practices. Over time, its reach expanded considerably, eventually encompassing heresy in all its forms, blasphemy, bigamy, witchcraft, and any belief or behavior that the Inquisition's appointed officials decided contradicted correct Catholic doctrine. What made the Spanish Inquisition uniquely powerful as an instrument of social control was not primarily its use of torture, though torture was employed within carefully defined legal guidelines. What made it truly formidable was its use of uncertainty. Nobody who fell under suspicion ever knew precisely what evidence existed against them, who had provided it, or what specific accusation they were required to answer. Accused individuals were expected to confess, but they were rarely told in advance what they were expected to confess to, which created a psychological environment of total disorientation that experienced inquisitors understood was more effective than any physical instrument in producing cooperation. The procedural reality of the Inquisition was considerably more complex than its popular reputation suggests, and that complexity made it more frightening rather than less. Inquisitors were typically trained lawyers and theologians, educated men who operated according to detailed procedural manuals, specifying exactly when torture could be applied, for how long, under what conditions, and with what level of medical supervision. Torture was technically limited to a single session, though inquisitors developed creative interpretations of what constituted a single session that would have impressed even the most determined legal scholars. The most commonly used method was the strappado, in which the prisoner's hands were bound behind their back. They were hoisted toward the ceiling by a rope attached to their wrists, and then dropped suddenly, stopping just before hitting the ground, the jolt dislocating the shoulders with a reliable violence that required no specialized equipment beyond a rope and a ceiling beam. Confession obtained under torture was legally required to be confirmed the following day, without duress, to be considered valid, which meant that a prisoner who recanted their confession could simply be tortured again. The system was designed not merely to punish heresy, but to make the very concept of internal resistance feel exhausting and ultimately pointless, which for a great many people, across nearly 3.5 centuries of operation, it effectively did. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed across Europe and colonial America following conviction for witchcraft. The range in that estimate is itself revealing. Historians cannot agree on the precise number because record-keeping was inconsistent, because many trials occurred in small communities where documentation was minimal, and because the definition of witchcraft shifted constantly depending on the region, the decade, the religious climate, and occasionally the personal animosities of whoever happened to be sitting in judgment that particular afternoon. What the records do confirm with uncomfortable clarity is the demographic pattern. Approximately 75% of those executed were women, typically older women, typically women who lived alone, owned property, practiced herbal medicine, argued with neighbors, or simply existed at the edges of community life in ways that made them visible and vulnerable simultaneously. The crime of witchcraft was uniquely suited to persecution precisely because it was invisible. No physical evidence was required. No witness needed to have seen anything concrete. The damage attributed to witchcraft, spoiled crops, sick livestock, inexplicable illness, a child's sudden fever, a neighbor's mysterious misfortune, was exactly the kind of damage that occurred constantly in pre-industrial communities for entirely natural reasons, and that medieval and early modern people had no reliable framework for explaining otherwise. The legal procedures developed to investigate witchcraft accusations reveal something deeply important about how fear transforms judicial systems from instruments of justice into instruments of persecution. The most notorious manual of witch hunting, the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by two German Dominican inquisitors, provided detailed instructions for identifying, interrogating, and convicting suspected witches, and its internal logic was almost impossible to escape once the machinery began moving. Accused witches who confessed were guilty and executed. Accused witches who maintained their innocence were assumed to be lying, since the devil provided his servants with the ability to endure questioning without breaking, and were subjected to increasingly severe examination until confession was obtained. The accused body itself became evidence. Witch hunters searched for the devil's mark, an insensible spot on the skin that did not bleed when pierced. And since human skin contains areas of varying sensitivity, and since a determined examiner pressing needles methodically across an entire body will eventually find a spot that produces less reaction than others, the evidence was essentially guaranteed in advance. The Salem witch trials of 1,692, which resulted in 19 executions and the imprisonment of hundreds more, demonstrated that this machinery required no professional inquisitors, no church authorization, and no sophisticated legal system to function. It required only accusation, community fear, and a judicial framework that had already decided, before any individual trial began, that the accused was almost certainly guilty. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed across Europe and colonial America following conviction for witchcraft. The range in that estimate is itself revealing. Historians cannot agree on the precise number because record-keeping was inconsistent, because many trials occurred in small communities where documentation was minimal, and because the definition of witchcraft shifted constantly depending on the region, the decade, the religious climate, and occasionally the personal animosities of whoever happened to be sitting in judgment that particular afternoon. What the records do confirm with uncomfortable clarity is the demographic pattern. Approximately 75% of those executed were women, typically older women, typically women who lived alone, owned property, practiced herbal medicine, argued with neighbors, or simply existed at the edges of community life in ways that made them visible and vulnerable simultaneously. The crime of witchcraft was uniquely suited to persecution precisely because it was invisible. No physical evidence was required. No witness needed to have seen anything concrete. The damage attributed to witchcraft, spoiled crops, sick livestock, inexplicable illness, a child's sudden fever, a neighbor's mysterious misfortune, was exactly the kind of damage that occurred constantly in pre-industrial communities for entirely natural reasons, and that medieval and early modern people had no reliable framework for explaining otherwise. The legal procedures developed to investigate witchcraft accusations reveal something deeply important about how fear transforms judicial systems from instruments of justice into instruments of persecution. The most notorious manual of witch hunting, the Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by two German Dominican inquisitors, provided detailed instructions for identifying, interrogating, and convicting suspected witches, and its internal logic was almost impossible to escape once the machinery began moving. Accused witches who confessed were guilty and executed. Accused witches who maintained their innocence were assumed to be lying, since the devil provided his servants with the ability to endure questioning without breaking, and were subjected to increasingly severe examination until confession was obtained. The accused body itself became evidence. Witch hunters searched for the devil's mark, an insensible spot on the skin that did not bleed when pierced. And since human skin contains areas of varying sensitivity, and since a determined examiner pressing needles methodically across an entire body will eventually find a spot that produces less reaction than others, the evidence was essentially guaranteed in advance. The Salem witch trials of 1692, which resulted in 19 executions and the imprisonment of hundreds more, demonstrated that this machinery required no professional inquisitors, no church authorization, and no sophisticated legal system to function. It required only accusation, community fear, and a judicial framework that had already decided, before any individual trial began, that the accused was almost certainly guilty. Medieval law across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia operated on a principle that modern legal systems have largely abandoned, but that felt entirely logical within its original context. The punishment should physically reflect the crime. A thief used their hands to steal. Therefore, the hands were the appropriate target of judicial response. A man who spread false rumors used his tongue. Therefore, the tongue could be removed or split. A person convicted of bearing false witness used their eyes to observe and their ears to hear false testimony. Therefore, eyes and ears became legally available targets for the court's corrective attention. This philosophy, sometimes described by legal historians as a form of Talion law, meaning punishment mirroring the offense, produced a judicial landscape in which the human body was treated as a kind of moral ledger, with crimes recorded not in prison sentences or financial penalties, but in permanent physical alterations that announced themselves to every person the convicted individual encountered for the remainder of their life. It was branding taken further, made more specific, more personal, and considerably more difficult to conceal beneath clothing, or redirect through simple relocation to a new town. The practical application of mutilation sentences across medieval Europe was documented extensively in court records that survive in archives across England, France, Germany, and Scandinavia. And what those records reveal is a system applied with striking consistency across centuries and jurisdictions. English law prescribed the removal of a hand for serious theft with a persistence that lasted from the Anglo-Saxon period well into the Norman era. Markets in medieval towns sometimes featured posts where severed hands were displayed as warnings, the same architectural logic that placed executed traitors' heads above city gates. In certain Islamic legal traditions, operating concurrently across the medieval period, the amputation of the right hand for theft was a prescribed religious penalty, applied within specific evidentiary standards, considerably stricter than most European courts required. Byzantine legal codes prescribed blinding for certain categories of political crime, considering it preferable to execution because it neutralized a dangerous rival without creating a martyr. The Emperor Basil II of Byzantium famously blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners of war in 1014, leaving one eye to every 100th man so that the survivors could lead the rest home. A calculation so deliberately cruel in its precision that it reads less like military strategy and more like a message composed in human suffering and delivered across an entire civilization simultaneously. In medieval and early modern Europe, execution days were not somber. Private affairs conducted behind prison walls, with minimal witnesses and official paperwork filed quietly afterward. They were events, scheduled in advance, announced publicly, and anticipated by entire communities with an enthusiasm that modern sensibilities find deeply uncomfortable, but that made complete internal sense within the world that produced them. In London, executions at Tyburn, the primary hanging ground located roughly where Marble Arch stands today, drew crowds that contemporary accounts estimate in the tens of thousands for particularly notable cases. Vendors worked the crowd selling food, ale, and printed broadsheets describing the condemned person's crimes in vivid and frequently embellished detail. Seats in overlooking windows were rented to wealthier spectators who wanted an unobstructed view without standing in the mud below. Pickpockets, a category of criminal whose chosen profession was itself a hanging offense, worked the execution crowds with a professional confidence that said something profound about the limits of deterrence as a judicial philosophy. The condemned person was transported from the prison through the streets in a cart, sometimes over a route several miles long, allowing the maximum number of people to observe them before they reached the scaffold. Crowds lined the streets throughout, some jeering, some praying, some simply watching, with the quiet attention of people witnessing something they understood to be significant. The theatrical dimensions of public execution were not accidental. They were carefully managed by authorities who understood that the death of a convicted criminal served multiple simultaneous social functions, and that maximizing the audience maximized the impact of each one. The condemned person was expected to perform their own death correctly, meaning they were expected to confess publicly, express appropriate remorse, affirm the justice of their sentence, and die with enough composure to demonstrate that the legal system had brought them to a proper spiritual reckoning before ending their life. A condemned person who died well, who spoke calmly from the scaffold, forgave their executioner, and expressed genuine penitence, actually reinforced the authority of the system that was killing them. Conversely, a condemned person who raged, protested their innocence convincingly, or died in obvious agony could destabilize the crowd's confidence in the proceedings, which is why prison chaplains spent considerable time in the days before executions working to ensure the condemned arrived at the scaffold in a theologically cooperative frame of mind. Samuel Johnson, the 18th century English writer, observed that the last speech of a condemned criminal at Tyburn attracted more genuine public attention than almost any other form of communication available in his era. He was not exaggerating. Printed copies of final speeches sold in enormous quantities. The executed criminal, for one brief moment on a wooden platform above a crowd of thousands, possessed a public platform and an audience that most living people never achieved, which created the deeply strange situation of execution functioning simultaneously as punishment, entertainment, moral instruction, and everything you have heard across these 15 sections: the rack and the wheel, the pillory and the brand, the boiling cauldron and the breaking of bones in public squares. All of it was designed, administered, and defended by people who considered themselves civilized. That is the fact that history asks us to sit with quietly and seriously. The judges who signed torture warrants were educated men. The priests who blessed execution grounds genuinely believed they were performing a spiritual service. The crowds who attended public floggings and beheadings were not uniquely savage people separated from us by some fundamental difference in human wiring. They were people operating inside a system of beliefs, institutions, and social pressures that made what they were witnessing feel not merely acceptable, but necessary. Medieval punishment was not a failure of civilization. It was civilization, expressing its deepest assumptions about power, order, guilt, and the human body through the most direct language available to it. Understanding that distinction matters because it removes the comfortable distance we tend to place between ourselves and the past. The reassuring sense that we would have known better, that we would have objected, that we would have been the one person in the crowd who turned away. The history of punishment is ultimately a history of what societies choose to believe about human beings and what they believe human beings deserve. Every generation inherits a legal system built on assumptions it rarely examines closely. Assumptions about who deserves protection, whose suffering counts as suffering, which categories of person can be treated in ways that would be unthinkable if applied to others. Medieval authorities did not believe they were being cruel. They believed they were being just, and they built elaborate theological and philosophical frameworks to support that belief with considerable intellectual sophistication. The question that medieval punishment forces us to ask is not simply, how did they live with themselves? But what equivalent assumptions are embedded so deeply in our own present systems that we cannot yet see them clearly? Assumptions that future generations will examine. with the same mixture of horror and fascinated disbelief that we bring to the history of the rack, the wheel, and the execution crowds of Tyburn. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it does have a persistent habit of reminding us that certainty about our own justice is precisely the state of mind in which the worst injustices have always been committed most confidently.